The Galactic Conclave had been around for 11,000 years. It was the greatest gathering of minds and civilizations in the known universe. 47 species sat inside its grand chamber, each one with a voice, each one with a vote. The chamber itself was enormous, a spinning space station the size of a small moon, built by the oldest races long before humans had even learned to make fire. Every seat inside that chamber had meaning. The closer a species sat to the dais of voices, the central platform where the most powerful species spoke, the more respected they were. The seats were not given out randomly. There was a system, a formula. It measured things like how long a species had been traveling among the stars, how large their population was, how advanced their technology was, and how much territory they controlled. The conclave called it the hierarchy of ascension. Every species accepted it because the formula was supposed to be fair. Humanity had joined the conclave 60 years ago. Back then, they came in quietly. They were new. They were small. They had only just figured out how to fold space and travel between star systems. And the older races looked at them the way a grown adult might look at a child who had just learned to walk. Humans were given a seat in the outer ring, the farthest row from the dais, near the back of the chamber, next to species that were barely capable of leaving their own solar systems. It was not an insult, the conclave said. It was simply where a new species belonged. The humans accepted it. They sat down, they watched, they listened. And then they got to work. In the 60 years that followed, humanity did something that no species in the history of the conclave had ever done at such a speed. Not slowly, not carefully, not in the measured and cautious way that the elder races approved of, but fast, with a kind of restless energy that the rest of the galaxy found deeply unsettling. They colonized their first new star system within a decade of joining, then another, then 3 more after that. By the time 60 years had passed, humans had planted their flag in 31 star systems, built cities on dozens of worlds, and grown their population to a number that made the old census records look like a rounding error. Their military fleet had grown too. When humanity first joined the conclave, they brought 12 ships with them, small, modest vessels that the elder races had politely pretended to be impressed by. Now, the human fleet numbered over 4,000. They were not the biggest ships in the galaxy, but they were fast, well-armed, and crewed by people who had spent generations learning how to survive in the coldest and most dangerous places the universe had to offer. Every 10 years, the conclave ran a census. It was automatic. It was handled by the same formula that had existed for thousands of years, and the results were supposed to be binding. When the latest census finished calculating, the results came back with a clear answer. Humanity's numbers had changed so dramatically that the formula placed them far above their current seat. Not just a few rows closer. The algorithm said humanity should be elevated to the inner ring, just 3 seats away from the dais of voices itself. 3 seats from the most powerful place in the chamber. It was a stunning result. Even some of the humans were surprised by it. But the elder races were not surprised. They had been watching the numbers grow for decades, and they had been quietly dreading this moment. A group of senior delegates, led by the Vethkari, a species of tall, cold-blooded beings, who had occupied one of the top seats on the dais for over 3,000 years, met in a closed session. A private meeting, with no record open to the public, no junior species invited, no humans present. In that meeting, they changed the formula. It was small and careful. A few adjustments buried deep inside the calculation. New rules that said cultural maturity had to be measured differently. New weight given to how long a species had maintained peace without a single internal conflict. A rule that, conveniently, humanity failed because of a border skirmish between 2 human colonies 7 years prior that had lasted all of 4 months. New language about what counted as civilized expansion versus aggressive colonization. When the adjusted formula ran again, humanity's ranking dropped. Not to the outer ring, but far enough that the elevation was denied. The conclave voted to maintain the existing seating arrangement. The motion passed. The record showed that the vote had been unanimous among the senior delegates. The humans were told the formula had simply been updated in the interest of accuracy. They were told this was routine. They were told they should be patient. In a few more decades, perhaps, the numbers would look different. What the Vethkari did not know, what none of the elder races had bothered to consider, was that the humans had been paying very close attention to everything in that chamber for 60 years. They had learned the language of the conclave the way someone learns the language of a country they plan to live in forever. They had studied every rule, every procedure, every bylaw and amendment. They had made friends among the smaller species. They had quietly built relationships with dozens of junior delegates who were never invited to the important meetings. And one of those junior delegates had a contact inside the technical administration team that managed the census system. The humans had a copy of the original formula. They had a copy of the amended formula. They had the timestamps showing exactly when the change was made. They had the access logs showing which delegates had entered the closed session and when. They had everything laid out in a clean document, verified and double-checked. Ambassador Ilara Voss sat in her small office on the outer ring and read through it all one last time. She was not a loud person. She was not a dramatic person. She was a woman who had spent 30 years in diplomacy, who had negotiated trade deals in rooms where half the other species could have eaten her, and who had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of powerful people was simply no more than they did. She closed the document. She looked out the window at the stars. Then she called her team together and told them to prepare her speech for the next full session of the conclave. She told them to make sure every delegate in the chamber would be present, every species, every row, from the dais all the way back to the outer ring. She wanted a full house. She had something to show them. The main chamber of the galactic conclave was a place that made even the most confident beings feel small. The ceiling stretched so high above that it was lost in shadow. The walls curved inward like the inside of a giant shell, lined with row after row of seats that climbed upward in a wide arc. At the very bottom, at the center of everything, sat the dais of voices, a raised circular platform made of a dark stone that the Vethkari had quarried from their homeworld thousands of years ago. It was a symbol, a reminder of who had built this place and who, in their minds, still owned it. Every seat was filled that day. Word had spread that the human delegation had requested a full session. No one knew exactly what it was about, but the request had been formal and correct in every procedural detail, which meant it could not be refused. Species that had not attended a full session in years sent their delegates anyway. The smaller races in the outer rows leaned forward in their seats. The elder races near the dais sat back with their arms folded, wearing the patient expressions of people who expected to be bored. Ambassador Ilara Voss walked to the outer ring podium alone. She was a small woman by human standards, and by the standards of most species in the chamber, she was tiny. She had short gray hair and dark eyes that moved around the room slowly before she began, as if she was counting the faces and making sure every single one of them was watching. She carried a data tablet in one hand and nothing else. No notes, no prepared responses, no backup speaker waiting in the wings. She tapped the podium controls and sent a file to every screen in the chamber. Every delegate, from the dais to the outermost row, received the same document at the same moment. She gave them 10 seconds to open it. Then she began to speak. Not the careful, practiced calm of someone hiding anger, but the real, settled calm of someone who had already decided what was going to happen, and was simply walking everyone else through it. She told the chamber that the document they were looking at was the original hierarchy of ascension formula, the one that had governed seat placement for over 3,000 years. She told them to look at the second page, which showed the amended version. She told them to look at the third page, which showed the exact timestamp of when the amendment was made. She told them to look at the fourth page, which showed the names of every delegate who had entered the closed session where the change was approved. She did not call anyone a liar. She did not use the word fraud. She did not raise her voice even once. She simply showed them the numbers and let the numbers do the talking. The chamber was very quiet. The Vethkari elder, Svarath, sat at the dais with his long neck held high and his pale eyes fixed on the human ambassador. He was ancient, even by the standards of his own people. He had watched species rise and fall. He had seen wars end, and treaties signed, and civilizations collapse into dust. He was not a being who was easily shaken, and he was not shaken now. He was something colder than shaken. He was annoyed. When Alara finished presenting her evidence, Svarath rose from his seat. His movements were slow and deliberate, the way all Vethkari moved, as if the universe had agreed to wait for them. He looked down at the outer ring where Alara stood, and when he spoke, his translated voice came through the chamber speakers with the smooth, unhurried tone of someone who had never once in his life been told he was wrong. He said the formula had been updated in the interest of long-term stability. He said that rapid expansion without cultural depth was a known risk factor in galactic history. He said that humanity, however impressive their numbers might look on paper, had existed for a cosmological eye blink. He said that impulsive species with a history of conflict, and here his eyes rested on Alara without blinking, were a destabilizing influence in a body that had maintained peace for millennia. He said all of this calmly, with the confidence of someone who had never needed to worry about the reaction of the person he was speaking to. He said it with 11,000 years of power behind every word. Alara listened to all of it, without moving. She stood at the outer ring podium and watched him finish. And when the chamber was quiet again, she did not argue. She did not present a countercase. She did not ask for a revote or call for an independent review, or do any of the things that the conclave's procedures offered her. She turned around and looked at the human delegations seated behind her. There were 43 of them in total, diplomats and scientists, military advisors, and trade representatives. Men and women who had traveled from across 31 human star systems to sit in those outer ring seats and be told, politely and repeatedly, that their place was at the back of the room. They had all heard Svarath's speech. They had all seen the document. They had all been waiting, in their own quiet way, for this exact moment. Alara looked at them for exactly 1 second. Then she said 4 words. Prepare the formal withdrawal. For a moment, nothing happened. The chamber had not yet processed what it had heard. Then the murmuring started, low and confused at first, spreading outward from the dais in waves, climbing through the rows, until the entire chamber was buzzing with it. The Exhari delegates looked at each other. The Dorvan representatives stood up before being pulled back down by her aide. Several of the junior species in the outer rows were already talking rapidly into their communication pieces, sending urgent messages back to their home worlds. Only the Vethkari remained still. Svarath watched as the human delegation rose from their seats, one by one, gathered their materials, and began walking toward the chamber exit. He watched Alara Voss step down from the podium and join them. He watched 43 humans move together through the long aisle of the chamber in silence, not rushing, not looking back. A younger Vethkari aide leaned close to him and whispered that perhaps someone should stop them. Perhaps someone should say something. Perhaps this was the kind of moment that required a response. Svarath said nothing. He watched the humans reach the chamber doors. He watched the doors open. He watched them walk through. The doors closed behind the last human with a sound that was very soft and very final, like a page being turned at the end of a chapter that everyone had thought would go on much longer. The chamber stayed loud for a long time after that. Delegates argued and called for procedure and asked what happened next. But underneath all of it was something that none of them had felt before, a thin thread of cold uncertainty that had no name yet, because no species in that room had ever watched humanity walk away from anything and wondered whether they had just made the biggest mistake of their 11,000-year history. All except one delegate, far back in the outer rows, a young Ket Allah, small and feathered and wide-eyed, who had watched everything happen from beginning to end. She leaned over to the colleague beside her and said quietly that she did not think the humans were bluffing. Her colleague told her not to worry, the humans would be back. She did not say anything to that. She simply looked at the closed doors and thought about what she knew of human history. The long, brutal, complicated history of a species that had survived everything their own world had thrown at them. And she thought that maybe for the first time in a very long time, the elder races had miscalculated. Nobody believed it at first. That was the honest truth. When word spread across the galaxy that humanity had formally withdrawn from the Galactic Conclave, most species assumed it was a political move, a short protest, the kind of thing that younger civilizations did when they felt ignored. They made noise, they caused a scene, and then after a few weeks of feeling important, they came back to the table and accepted whatever compromise was offered to them. It had happened before. The Dorvan Collective had walked out of a trade summit once and returned within 6 days. The Ixhari had refused to attend 3 consecutive sessions in protest of a border ruling and had quietly resumed their seat before anyone had to formally ask them to. The elder races had seen this pattern many times. They were not worried. They were wrong. Within the first 24 hours of the human withdrawal, the practical effects were small and easy to ignore. A few shared research stations reported that their human staff had packed their belongings and left. Some joint communication relays showed drops in maintenance activity. Minor things. Administrative noise. Nothing to concern the senior delegates who were already preparing a measured and dignified response that would allow humanity to return without either side losing face. By the end of the second day, the picture had changed. 3 asteroid mining operations in the outer Verdan belt, operations that 6 different species had financial stakes in, went dark. The humans had been running the coordination systems that kept those operations synchronized. Without that coordination, 2 of the 3 sites had to halt extraction entirely because the automated systems could not safely manage the workload alone. The losses started to add up within hours. By the 3rd day, something far more serious had happened. The Ixhari Trade Federation controlled a network of 12 outer colonies, scattered across the edges of explored space. Those colonies depended on regular supply runs and communication signals to stay connected to the Federation's core worlds. What the Ixhari had never fully examined, because why would they, when everything had been running smoothly for years, was that the fastest and most reliable route between their core worlds and their outer colonies passed through a jump relay station that humanity had built and maintained inside human territory. It was one of dozens of such stations that humans had constructed over the past few decades. Small installations that boosted faster-than-light communication signals and made long-distance travel more efficient. The humans shut down that station on the 3rd day. The Ixhari lost contact with 6 of their outer colonies simultaneously. Not partial contact, complete silence. The kind of silence that, in the cold mathematics of space, could mean anything from a technical fault to a catastrophe. Panic moved through the Ixhari government faster than any signal could. Emergency ships were dispatched, but without the relay boost, travel times to the outer colonies tripled. The Ixhari delegate to the conclave sent 17 urgent messages to the Assembly's administrative office in a single afternoon. That was only the beginning. The Dorvan Collective had 2 major food supply chains that moved agricultural goods from fertile colony worlds to their more densely populated home systems. The routes had been established decades ago and had run without interruption for so long that most Dorvan citizens had no idea the routes existed. They simply expected food to arrive, and it did. What they also did not know was that 2 critical waypoints along those routes were managed by human traffic control systems. Without human operators to guide and schedule the enormous cargo vessels through those waypoints, the ships began to queue and then to stall. Shipments slowed. Within 5 days, 2 of the Dorvan home systems were reporting shortages in key food categories. There was something even worse waiting for the Vethkari. Sivarath received the report on the 5th day and read it 3 times before he called his senior advisors into a closed meeting. The report had come from a technical team that had been quietly reviewing the status of various monitoring systems around Vethkari space. During that review, the team had discovered something that had apparently been in place for 20 years without anyone in the Vethkari government knowing about it. A network of deep space sensor arrays, small, quiet, almost invisible against the background radiation of open space, had been positioned along a debris corridor that intersected with the outer edge of the Vethkari home system. The corridor was the projected path of a rogue neutron star's debris field. A slow-moving cloud of high-density fragments that drifted through that region of space and occasionally threw off pieces large enough to cause serious damage if they reached an inhabited system. For 20 years, those human sensor arrays had been tracking every fragment, calculating trajectories, and sending automated alerts whenever something required attention. For 20 years, human operators had quietly adjusted the Vethkari's own orbital defense systems, with permissions that had been granted so long ago that nobody currently in the Vethkari Defense Ministry could remember signing off on them, to account for incoming debris. The humans had turned off the alert system when they left. Not the defense systems themselves. They had not done anything aggressive or destructive. They had simply stopped maintaining a service that they had been providing for free, without recognition, for 2 decades. Sivarath sat very still for a long time after the meeting. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the assembly station, the mood had shifted from skepticism to unease, to something approaching quiet dread. Delegates who had laughed off the withdrawal 4 days earlier were now holding urgent private meetings with their home governments. The conclave's administrative body issued 2 formal statements calling on humanity to resume dialogue, both carefully worded to avoid sounding desperate, both ignored. The last human to leave the assembly station had been a junior diplomat named Caius Marin, a young man with an easy smile and the kind of patience that came from years of being underestimated. He had stayed behind after the rest of the delegation departed to handle the formal paperwork of the withdrawal, the correct filing of every document, the proper closing of every account, the careful and thorough completion of every administrative requirement that the conclave's own rules demanded. He had done it all, correctly and completely, because that was how humans operated when they wanted to make a point. When he finally walked toward the docking bay with his single travel bag over his shoulder, a Vethkari administrative aide stopped him at the entrance. The aide was young, not much older than Caius himself, and the uncertainty on his face was something that his species was not accustomed to wearing. The aide asked, in a voice that was quieter than intended, what it was that humanity actually wanted from all of this. What was the goal? What would it take to end it? He looked at the aide for a moment, not unkindly. He said that humanity had already told the conclave exactly what they wanted. They had presented the data. They had shown the evidence. They had made the request through every proper channel available to them. The answer had been no. He said the conclave had not been listening, and he said that was fine, because humanity had learned a long time ago that some lessons could not be taught with words. He picked up his bag and walked to his ship. The docking clamps released, and the vessel slipped away from the station into open space, growing smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed it completely. Behind it, the assembly station hummed with the sound of 46 civilizations beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, just how many things they had never thought to say thank you for. 3 months passed. No war. No ultimatum. No fleet of human warships sitting at anyone's border with weapons pointed and demands broadcasted. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that the elder races could point to and call aggression. Just silence. Wide, deep, and growing heavier with every passing week, like snow collecting on a roof that was not built to hold it. The conclave convened emergency session after emergency session. The chamber that had once felt like the center of the universe now felt like a room full of people trying very hard not to say the obvious thing out loud. Delegates argued about procedure. They debated the correct legal interpretation of a voluntary withdrawal. They formed committees. They issued statements. They did all the things that large and powerful institutions do when they are afraid but are not yet ready to admit it. None of it changed anything. The problems that had started in the first week had not gone away. The HFY outer colonies had been reached eventually by emergency vessels, but the cost of running ships at full speed across that distance without relay assistance had drained a significant portion of the Federation's emergency reserve fund. The colonies were fine, but the HFY government was furious, not at humanity, which would have been easier, but at the conclave, for creating a situation that had put their people at risk. The Dorvan food shortages had been resolved through emergency rationing and rapid rerouting of supply ships along longer, slower paths. But the disruption had caused civil unrest on two of their homeworlds, and the Dorvan delegate arrived at every session with a face like a storm that had not yet decided where to land. The Vethkari had quietly hired 3 independent contractor firms to rebuild the debris monitoring network around their home system. It was expensive, it was slower than anyone wanted. And it was a constant, daily reminder to Susvaroth and his government that they had spent 20 years being protected by a species they had dismissed as impulsive children, and had never once thought to check whether that protection was something they could replace on short notice. They could not. The smaller species watched all of this with a mixture of anxiety and something that was almost, though none of them would have said it aloud, satisfaction. The junior races, the ones who sat in the outer rows and had spent decades being talked over and looked past, had known for years that humanity was holding more of the conclave's infrastructure together than anyone in the inner rings wanted to acknowledge. They had seen the human engineers working in the maintenance corridors of the assembly station. They had used human-built navigation maps to chart safe paths through unstable regions of space that the elder races had never bothered to survey. They had known. They had simply had no power to say it in a way that anyone would listen to. Now the galaxy was learning on its own. A young delegate from the Ket Allah, a small bird-like species with bright copper-colored feathers and sharp black eyes, stood up during one of the emergency sessions and proposed a motion. Her name was Thessaly, and she had been one of the junior delegates present on the day the humans walked out. She had watched Alara Voss deliver her evidence, and she had watched Swarath dismiss it, and she had made a decision that day about what kind of delegate she wanted to be. Her motion was simple: offer humanity their inner ring seat, formally ratify the original census results, acknowledge the procedural irregularity in the amended formula, move forward. Sisvarath blocked it before she finished speaking. He did not shout. He did not argue with her evidence, because there was no evidence to argue with. He simply cited an elder block procedural rule that required a unanimous vote among senior species before any motion regarding membership status could be brought to the full chamber. Since the Vethkari would not vote yes, the motion could not proceed. He said this with the calm, flat certainty of someone reading from a document they had memorized long ago, and he sat back down and folded his long hands in his lap, as if the matter were settled. But she was already thinking about her next move. Far away from the assembly station, deep inside human space, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. Admiral Yusuf Adeyemi stood at the center of a wide monitoring room aboard a human deep space observation station, positioned at the edge of the Karanath boundary, the unofficial line where human territory ended and open, unclaimed space began. The room was full of screens and people, and the soft, constant noise of systems processing information. It was not a war room. There were no battle plans spread across the tables, no fleet positions being calculated, no targeting systems running warm. It was a watching room, and humanity was watching everything. Adeyemi was a large man with a quiet voice and the kind of stillness that came not from being relaxed, but from being very, very focused. He had spent 40 years in the human military, most of it in the deep black of space, and he had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was not when the fighting started. It was the long period before that, when everyone was deciding whether they were actually willing to go there. He read the intelligence reports every morning. He knew which species were struggling. He knew which governments were putting pressure on the conclave. He knew that Thessaly's motion had been blocked, and he knew that she was going to try again, and he had a reasonable idea of what would happen when she did. His junior communications officer, a young woman named Petra, looked up from her station and asked him the question that everyone in human space had been quietly asking each other for 3 months. She asked if they were going to win. Adeyemi did not answer immediately. He walked to the wide observation window at the far end of the room and looked out at the stars. There were so many of them out here, so far from the noise of the conclave and its thousands of years of politics and pride. Out here it was just space, cold and honest and indifferent to who was right. He thought about the word win for a long time. He thought about what winning actually meant for a species like humanity. Not the movies and monuments kind of winning that looked good on a history page. The real kind. The kind where the situation was better at the end than it was at the beginning. The kind where something was actually fixed and not just pushed down under the surface to come back later. He turned away from the window. He told Petra that they had already won. The moment Ilara walked out of that chamber with the evidence in her hand and every delegate watching, the outcome had been decided. Everything happening now was just the rest of the galaxy catching up to a conclusion that was already written. Petra asked how long that would take. Adeyemi almost smiled. He said he did not know exactly. He said these things moved at their own pace. He said that pride was the slowest thing in the universe to move. Slower than light, slower than time, slower than the drift of galaxies across the dark. But it did move. It always moved eventually. He went back to his desk and picked up the next report and kept reading, and outside the window the stars held still and bright and patient, the way stars always do when they are waiting for something that is already inevitable to finally arrive. It was not the Vethkari who broke first. Everyone had expected it to be them. The pressure on their home system was the most visible and the most personal. The debris monitoring network they were rebuilding was expensive and slow and nowhere near as reliable as the one humanity had quietly maintained for 20 years. Their government had received 3 separate warnings in the past month about debris fragments that required attention, and each time their new contractor systems had caught the warning late. Not dangerously late, but late enough to remind everyone involved that the margin for error in space was very small and growing smaller. But Sisvarath held. Whatever he felt behind those pale, unblinking eyes, he did not show it. He came to every session. He sat at the dais. He voted no on every motion that came close to addressing the human withdrawal. He was 11,000 years of civilization compressed into one very old and very stubborn body, and he was not going to be the one who flinched. It was the 31 other species who broke instead. Thessaly had not been idle during the 3 months of silence. While the senior delegates argued in the main chamber, she had been moving through the quieter corridors of the assembly station, talking to the delegates that nobody at the dais paid much attention to. The junior species, the outer ring representatives, the ones who had been watching the cracks spread through the conclave's foundations and had started doing the math on what happened if those cracks kept growing. She talked to all of them, one conversation at a time, in small rooms and empty dining halls, and the long connecting walkways between the station's outer modules. She was patient and careful, and she never pushed anyone into anything. She just laid out the facts clearly, the way she had watched Ilara Voss do it in the main chamber, and she let people arrive at their own conclusions. The conclusions were not hard to reach. On the 94th day after the human withdrawal, Thessaly filed a motion using a procedural clause that had existed in the Conclave's founding documents for over 8,000 years and had never once been used. It was called the Clause of Collective Necessity. It allowed a two-thirds majority of all member species to override a senior bloc veto in situations where the stability of the Conclave itself was at risk. It had been written into the founding documents as a theoretical safeguard, a last resort that the people who wrote it probably never imagined would actually be needed. 31 species co-signed the motion before it was filed. The chamber was full when it was read aloud. Not the politely full chamber of routine sessions, but the genuinely packed, standing room kind of full that only happened when history was being made and everyone could feel it. Delegates who had not left their home systems in years had made the journey. Even some species who were not conclave members sent observers who stood in the gallery and watched in silence. Sis Verath sat at the dais and listened to the motion being read and said nothing. When the reading was finished, the vote was called. It was fast and clean and completely without drama. 31 species voted yes. The elder bloc voted no. The count was announced. The motion passed. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Conclave, a senior bloc veto had been overridden by the collective voice of the membership. Then Thessaly stood up and filed a second motion immediately, before anyone could call for a recess or a procedural delay. It called for the full ratification of the original census results. It called for humanity's elevation to the inner ring. And it called for something that no one had expected. A formal offer of a permanent seat on the dais of voices itself, under a new provision that recognized rapid civilizational contribution as a qualifying standard for the highest level of membership. It passed with 34 votes. The message was sent to human space within the hour. Ambassador Ilara Voss received it at her office on the human colony world of Tharsis Deep, where she had spent the past 3 months doing exactly what she had told her team she would do during the withdrawal. Working. She had been coordinating trade agreements between human colonies, supervising the expansion of 2 new jump relay networks, and spending her evenings reading reports about the Conclave's emergency sessions with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. She read the message once. Then she sent 3 words back to the assembly station. We are coming. The human delegation arrived at the assembly station 6 days later. There were 60 of them this time, more than before, representing a wider range of human expertise and experience. They came aboard a vessel that was larger than the one they had left on, which was not an accident. They docked at the main bay, which was also not an accident. Every detail had been considered. Every signal had been intentional. Ilara walked into the main chamber, and it was quiet in a way that it had not been quiet since the day she left. The same rows, the same curved walls, the same dark stone of the dais at the center of everything. But the seats were different. The human delegation was guided not to the outer ring, but to the inner ring, 3 seats from the dais, exactly where the original formula had placed them. And at the dais itself, 1 seat to the left of center, a new position had been prepared. Ilara walked to it and sat down. She looked out at the chamber from this new height, and she took a slow breath, and she let herself have exactly 1 moment of feeling the weight of it. The 60 years of patience, the procedural battles, the careful collecting of evidence, the long silence of the withdrawal, all of it. And then she put it away, because that was not what today was for. When it was her turn to speak, she did not mention the walkout. She did not mention the amended formula, or the closed session, or the 3 months of silence. She did not look at Sis Verath, who sat at the far end of the dais, with his eyes forward and his face unreadable. She talked about what came next. She talked about a proposal for a new trade corridor that would cut travel time between the Ixari outer colonies and the Federation core worlds by 40%. She talked about an expanded version of the debris monitoring network, not just for the Vethkari home system, but for every inhabited system in the Conclave that sat near a known hazard zone. She talked about a joint research initiative that would bring together scientists from a dozen species to study 3 star systems on the edge of explored space, where early sensor data suggested the possibility of pre-spaceflight civilizations that the Conclave had not yet made contact with. She talked about the species no one in this chamber had met yet. She talked about what the Conclave could be if it functioned the way it was supposed to. Not as a place where old power protected itself, but as a place where every civilization, regardless of how long it had existed, could contribute what it had to offer. She talked about the future as if it were already being built. In the outer ring, a Vethkari aide sat beside Sisfaraf's empty chair. The old elder had left quietly during the recess before Ilara's speech, and had not returned. The aide was young, and had only been in his position for 2 years, and had spent most of those 2 years watching things happen that he had been told were impossible. He listened to Ilara speak, and he thought about what his people called the long understanding, the slow process by which a civilization finally grasped a truth it had been avoiding. He thought that perhaps the long understanding, for his people, had arrived, and in the gallery above, Thessaly sat with her small copper-feathered hands folded in her lap, and watched the human ambassador speak from the dais, and felt something settle in her chest, like a weight being set down after a very long walk. She did not know what the Conclave would look like in another 60 years. She did not know what humanity would build, or discover, or change in that time. She did not know what new species might one day walk through those chamber doors, and sit in the outer ring, and look toward the dais with wide, uncertain eyes. But she knew that today something had shifted, something real and permanent, and not easily undone. The galaxy had watched in terror as the humans walked out. Now it watched in silence as they built something better than what had been there before. And that, in the end, was exactly what humanity had always done.